Washington, which took place on August 28, 1963. Bayard Rustin's replacement in 1961 as secretary and advisor to King was Jack Odell, also known as Hunter Pitts Odell. According to official records, in 1962 Jack Odell was a member of the National Committee of the Communist Party, USA. He had been listed as a Communist Party member as early as 1956. Odell was also given the job of acting executive director for SCLC activities for the entire Southeast, according to the St. Louis Globe-Democrat of October 26, 1962. At that time, there were still some patriots in the press corps, and word of Odell's party membership became known. What did King do? Shortly after the negative news reports, King fired Odell with much fanfare, and he then, without the fanfare, immediately hired him again as director of the New York office of the SCLC, as confirmed by the Richmond News Leader of September 27, 1963. In 1963, a black man from Monroe, North Carolina, named Robert Williams made a trip to Peking, China. Exactly 20 days before King's 1963 march on Washington, Williams successfully urged Mao Zedong to speak out on behalf of King's movement. Mr. Williams was also around this time maintaining his primary residence in Cuba, from which he made regular broadcasts to the southern U.S. 3 times a week from high-power transmitters in Havana under the title Radio Free Dixie. In these broadcasts, he urged violent attacks by blacks against white Americans. During this period, Williams wrote a book entitled Negroes with Guns. The writer of the foreword for this book, none other than Martin Luther King, Jr. It is also interesting to note that the editors and publishers of this book were 2 all supporters of the infamous Fair Play for Cuba Committee. According to King's biographer and sympathizer David J. Garrow, King privately described himself as a Marxist. In his 1981 book, The FBI and Martin Luther King, Jr., Garrow quotes King as saying in SCLC staff meetings, "We have moved into a new era, which must be an era of revolution. The whole structure of American life must be changed. We are engaged in the class struggle." Jewish communist Stanley Levison can best be described as King's behind-the-scenes handler. Levison, who had for years been in charge of the secret funneling of Soviet funds to the Communist Party, USA, was King's mentor, and was actually the brains behind many of King's more successful ploys. It was Levison who edited King's book, Stride Toward Freedom. It was Levison who arranged for a publisher. Levison even prepared King's income tax returns. It was Levison who really controlled the fundraising and agitation activities of the SCLC. Levison wrote many of King's speeches. King described Levison as one of his closest friends. FBI. King bought sex with SCLC money. The Federal Bureau of Investigation had for many years been aware of Stanley Levison's communist activities. It was Levison's close association with King that brought about the initial FBI interest in King. Lest you be tempted to believe the controlled media's lie about racists in the FBI being out to get King, you should be aware that the man most responsible for the FBI's probe of King was Assistant Director William C. Sullivan. Sullivan describes himself as a liberal and says that initially I was 100% for King because I saw him as an effective and badly needed leader for the black people in their desire for civil rights. The probe of King not only confirmed their suspicions about King's communist beliefs and associations, but it also revealed King to be a despicable hypocrite, an immoral degenerate, and a worthless charlatan. According to Assistant Director Sullivan, who had direct access to the surveillance files on King which are denied the American people, King had embezzled or misapplied substantial amounts of money contributed to the civil rights movement. King used SCLC funds to pay for liquor, and numerous prostitutes, both black and white, who were brought to his hotel rooms, often 2 at a time, for drunken sex parties which sometimes lasted for several days. These types of activities were the norm for King's speaking and organizing tours. In fact, an outfit called the National Civil Rights Museum in Memphis, Tennessee, which is putting on display the 2 bedrooms from the Lorraine Motel, where King stayed the night before he was shot, has declined to depict in any way the occupants of those rooms, that according to exhibit designer Gerard Eisterhold would be close to blasphemy. The reason? Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. spent his last night on Earth having sex with 2 women at the motel and physically beating and abusing a third. Sullivan also stated that King had alienated the affections of numerous married women. According to Sullivan, who in 30 years with the Bureau had seen everything there was to be seen of the seamy side of life, King was one of only 7 people he had ever encountered who was such a total degenerate. Noting the violence that almost invariably attended King's supposedly non-violent marches, Sullivan's probe revealed a very different King from the carefully crafted public image. King welcomed members of many different black groups as members of his SCLC, many of them advocates and practitioners of violence. King's only admonition on the subject was that they should embrace tactical non-violence. Sullivan also relates an incident in which King met in a financial conference with Communist Party representatives, not knowing that one of the participants was an infiltrator actually working for the FBI. J. Edgar Hoover personally saw to it that documented information on King's communist connections was provided to the President and to Congress, and conclusive information from FBI files was also provided to major newspapers and newswire services. But were the American people informed of King's real nature? No, for even in the 1960s, the fix was in the controlled media, and the bought politicians were bound and determined to push their racial mixing program on America. King was their man, and nothing was going to get in the way. With a few minor exceptions, these facts have been kept from the American people. The pro-King propaganda machine grinds on, and it is even reported that a serious proposal has been made to add some of King's writings as a new book in the Bible. Ladies and gentlemen, the purpose of this radio program is far greater than to prove to you the immorality and subversion of this man called King. I want you to start to think for yourselves. I want you to consider this. What are the forces and motivation behind the controlled media's active promotion of King? What does it tell you about our politicians when you see them, almost without exception, falling all over themselves to honor King as a national hero? What does it tell you about our society when any public criticism of this moral leper and communist functionary is considered grounds for dismissal? What does it tell you about the controlled media when you see how they have successfully suppressed the truth and held out a picture of King that can only be described as a colossal lie? You need to think, my fellow Americans. You desperately need to wake up. J. Edgar Hoover reportedly discovered that King had numerous love affairs. Hoover had at least 15 reels of tape about sexual entertainment and conversations between King and Abernathy that might lead to the conclusion that there was a homosexual relationship between the two ministers, noted Rowan.71 during a discussion with someone in the FBI. Rowan discovered that there had been sexual intercourse in the King's suite with Rev. Ralph David Abernathy. At another time, there was an orgy. Those conversations had both been taped by one of the FBI's bugs.72. The black newspaper writer and television talk show host Tony Brown mentioned the reported conversation between King and Abernathy behind closed doors. In Brown's column, he described King's reported love. Open quote, "Come on over here, you big, black blank, and let me blank your blank," Martin Luther King said to his friend, Rev. Ralph David Abernathy. And what about his opposition to the Vietnam War? Since the government would not enforce its own laws, was too busy fighting other branches or political parties, or simply did not know or care what its laws meant, Martin Luther King Jr. was allowed to walk unscathed, with nothing to fear from the members of the government who were bickering over trivialities. When he began his campaign to undermine the government, especially during the Vietnam War, he was met with little resistance. The permissive attitude of the American government when it comes to dealing with subversive minority groups may be its undoing. The Vietnam War was, in my opinion, only second to the Civil War as being the most divisive war in U.S. history. Protesters fought supporters in the streets. Both the pro-war and anti-war sides made massive propaganda campaigns. If you voiced dissent, you would be associated with leftists, although that was not always the case. Not all the people who were against the Vietnam War were dishonorable. During the Vietnam protests, there were 3 main groups who were quite vocal. The first group was those people who were leftists and were against the war. They opposed the war to such an extent that their protests of the war often resulted in violent opposition. The second group was peace-loving citizens and nationalists who were against the war. The third group was the people who believed in America, right or wrong, and followed the government's orders without question. Briefly examine the 3 main groups operating during the Vietnam War. 1. There were Without question, many subversives who were working